Have you ever seen a movie that's so good you had to watch it twice? But you got a movie you're thinking about, something. So I heard yes behind me. Autumn's got a couple. Aaron John has got a couple. I posted something on Facebook yesterday. It was like our most popular Facebook post ever because everyone's got a movie. And I'm not talking about that movie that you have to watch. Thomas and Friends and the Misty Island Rescue, or Thomas and Friends and the Tale of the Brave, or Thomas and Friends and the Lion of Sodor. You're watching that 16 times a day, talking to Mr. Topham Hat in your sleep. Dun, 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 dun. You know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the movies you want to watch, like Shawshank Redemption, Braveheart, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Top Gun, all 89. Man, we got a lot of amens. Now you better keep this up while I'm preaching. All 89 movies starring Nicolas Cage. I'm not making that up. Google that. 89 movies with Nicolas Cage. All the Sharknado films. Definitely not Game of Thrones, way too inappropriate. But absolutely all those cool movies from the 80s like Goonies, Breakfast Club, and Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Now you're gonna go home and watch those, aren't you? We all have that favorite movie we love to watch over and over and over again because sometimes something is so good it's worth repeating. And that includes some of the most well-known passages in the Bible. Last week when we were talking about generosity, Bill mentioned how we can sometimes avoid using some of the most well-known passages of Scripture because we want to find something fresh or unique. But sometimes the passages we know are passages that convey incredible truth. And so they're worth repeating. This morning as we continue this series called The Balance, where we discuss the balance we walk between holiness and grace, I want to work through a passage that I just spoke on a year ago, actually last January, a passage that I'll probably teach on one time a year, a passage in Luke 15 that we call the story of the prodigal son. And this passage has so many layers, I feel like I can probably preach on it once a year and it'll always be fresh. It'll never run out of richness, especially when we're talking about the necessity of both grace and holiness in the life of the believer. As we said last week, if we accentuate holiness and leave out grace, we can end up with a message of rules, and that's called legalism. If we accentuate grace and we leave out holiness, we end up a message where we, human beings, create the standard of righteousness, and this is called antinomianism. Neither of these are the true gospel because they get the balance wrong. Grace, as I said last week, appears in the New Testament 120 times. Holiness appears 230 times, which is the same amount of times the word love appears. What this tells us is that both of these concepts, grace and holiness, are tremendously important. Tremendously important. So we have to constantly search and live in the middle of this balance, holiness and grace, holiness and grace. And the story of the prodigal son illustrates this balance perhaps better than any other story in the Bible. So open your Bibles, if you will, to Luke chapter 15. If you don't have a Bible or you don't have a cell phone, you can use the screen above. Luke chapter 15, verse 11. So for some context, Jesus is getting a reputation for teaching and hanging out and spending time and having dinner with the very worst people of society. The tax collectors who are known essentially to betray their country, to betray their religion. Prostitutes and sinners and alcoholics and all the sort of people that you can see are the outcasts of society. Now the religious elite, the hypocrites, the people that want to kill Jesus are getting upset that Jesus would want to spend time with them because religious people don't hang out with those types of people. And they begin to challenge Jesus. So this story or parable is told to help the person who's had a past and also the person who's a bit self-righteous. The story is told to help them understand the nature of God and how he feels about people. And so as we read this parable, you can imagine that Jesus is outside. He's teaching in a courtyard, and present are these two groups of people. You have the sinner, and you have the accuser. You have people who've had a past and people who feel like they've got it all figured out. And these are the people who aren't quite walking the balance well. People who are on the extreme end of the grace-holiness balance. And so this is where Jesus begins his story. Jesus says there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to the father, "Father, give me my share of the estate. Give me my inheritance." So the father divided his property between them. Again, this is a fictional story used to teach a spiritual truth, also called a parable. In this story, there's 2 sons, one older son, a younger son, and the youngest son wanted his inheritance. He was restless and he was sick of being under his father's rule, sick of being under the community's boundaries. He was sick of his brother. So the father agrees to give him his inheritance, and the son makes plans to take off and sort of go out on his own. It says in verse 13, not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, and he set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. And so he gets all he has, he gathers all his resources, and he cashes out. He cashes out by selling essentially all the stuff that the father had given him. Livestock, land, crops, everything that the father had been saving all his life to give to his sons, the young man sells them for cash. And so the son sells all of his possessions. He gets some cash, and he takes off, and he gets as far away from home as he possibly can. You ever want to take off? Like it's a stressful day. You're like, I got to get out of here. I need a vacation. Kids are driving me crazy. My boss is driving me crazy. My parents are driving me crazy. I got to go. Well, that's what he does. A place far away. A place far away from his overbearing father and his overbearing brother. A place without boundaries or rules or restrictions where he can begin a new story. Now, I bet he probably has some dreams. He's got some plans for some things he wants to do when he gets to where he's going. He's going to invest some money. He's going to take that Dave Ramsey course and learn how to turn $4 into $7 billion. He's going to buy a taco truck and take it to downtown Damascus and sell some tacos and make some money. He's going to buy an Apple Store franchise and help eradicate the green text bubble from the world. So he leaves his father's home with all sort of dreams, all sort of hopes and aspirations. But he spends his money really quickly on what the Bible calls wild living. I love the King James says riotous living. And when you say wild living or riotous living, all of those things that you can think of in your mind, yeah, that's what he was doing. And he's doing a lot of it because he spent this vast fortune in a very short period of time. And so the son goes from having everything to having nothing in a very short time period. And even if you've never read this story before, you just know that things are going to go badly. And that's what happens. It says in verse 14, after he spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. And all of a sudden, being in a foreign country, very far away from home, doesn't sound like such a great idea because he's got no money. And there's no one to take him in. You know, when things are going bad, you can like call that friend up, be like, hey, can I stay in your basement for a little while? Hey, can I borrow $100? Hey, can I use your car? Like, he doesn't have that. That's not happening. He's far away. He doesn't have access to that father he was rebelling against anymore. But he's really hungry. And desperate times call for desperate measures. He doesn't have any ramen noodles. There's no Taco Bell with 98-cent tacos. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. And he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating. But no one gave him anything. So this man hires himself out to work with pigs. Has anybody here ever worked on a farm? Okay, all right. I've never worked on a farm, but I visited a farm and I saw like a movie with a farm in it. I saw pictures of a farm and it looks pretty dirty. I Like, I'm not dressed to be on a farm. I can't imagine being in the middle of a pig pen, getting all that poo up on you, you know? I can't imagine that. I don't want to be there. But that's where he's at because he's desperate. He has no money, and he's getting so hungry, so desperate, that he begins to crave the food that the pigs are eating, and these pig pods are things that fall off trees, kind of like tree bark. He's so hungry that he begins to crave tree bark. And you know, in that moment, he's starting to look back at his former life. And he's probably looking back with some regret and remorse. I should have listened to my dad. I should have listened to my brother. But here I am. I'm with these pigs, and I'm hungry. The text says that he came to his senses. Verse 17, when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death. So as he stands in the middle of a pig pen, wanting to eat the food that the pigs are eating, it occurs to him that his father's servants are eating well. The lowest person, the person of the lowest stature on his father's property, has a full stomach. And he thinks, man, if I could just have their table scraps, if I could just have a portion of what the servants have, I wouldn't be hungry like this. And I wouldn't be standing in the middle of this pig pen. It says in verse 18, I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. And so he got up and he went to his father. So he's going to his dad. He's even got a speech prepared. He's owning up to his shortcomings. He's acknowledging all the wrong he's done. He understands he's surrendered his birthright. He's already given that away. He's not going to get his fortune back. He's not going to get his place back. So he's hoping at best that his father will take him back as a servant. So he leaves his job behind. He swallows his pride. He puts one foot in front of the other, and he heads back home. On the surface, this guy has made some mistakes in judgment, dumb decisions that everybody's made, and so he's going to go back home as a remorseful fool. Remember when you were a teenager or a kid, or you go back home and you know you're in trouble, or you made your wife upset or your husband upset, or your boss upset, and you got to sort of go back and kind of face the music. I'm really sorry. I didn't see that car behind me, and I backed into the car, and their car's messed up, and my car's messed up. Definitely not a true story. Never happened to me. I've never backed into someone in my own driveway, but maybe you have. So you know how that feels. He's going home as a remorseful fool. But there's more than that. And when we read it, we may not pick up on it because this was written for a different time and a different culture. But he's going back as someone who's broken the holiness covenant of his family and community. In other words, he's just like many of the people Jesus has sitting in front of him. Probably like some of the people that we have here. And we see evidence of this in 4 spots. In verse 12, he asks for his inheritance early. This doesn't seem super offensive, but think about it. When do you get to have your inheritance? When someone dies. So if I'm saying I want my inheritance now, what am I saying? Dad, I kind of wish you were dead. Why can't you just die already? Please let me have your stuff, Dad. I need it now. You're an old man. You haven't died yet. You're still using the shovel in the field. You're in pretty good shape. Eating a lot of protein. Going to the gym. And you ain't dying yet. So I'm just going to have to take the money. That's pretty offensive. In verse 13, it says he sells everything and leaves home. So not only is he taking his father's possessions and treating them like a commodity that he could profit from, he's asking to be removed from Jewish society. And this is an offense not just against his father, but against his ancestry and culture. And so this is tremendously embarrassing to his father. Tremendously embarrassing to the community. But then in verse 13, it also says that the son spends his money on wild living, which you know from verse 30 is prostitutes and partying. In his father's house, this would have been shameful and unacceptable. His father probably had a wife in mind for him, a marriage that would have been arranged with another family, and this doesn't seem normal or cool to us, but in that time, arranged marriage meant peace, and that people would eat, and that people wouldn't have to die because they were getting in wars with their neighbors. So his behavior would have been another violation of his father's trust and plans for him. And finally, in verse 15, there's another violation. He takes a job that breaks the religious restrictions of his community because this young man is Jewish, and Jews are not even allowed to eat or touch pigs because it defiles them. It makes them unclean. It makes them unholy. It's against their most deep-seated religious convictions. So this young man has broken faith, he's broken trust, and he's broken the laws of the people, the laws of his community. Because the Jews had 3 divisions of the law. They had the moral law, which is how you behave according to the standard of God. This is like 10 Commandment type stuff. So he's breaking the law, the moral law, with his wild living. And then there's the civil law, which is how you behave in relationship to the rest of the community. He breaks this when he asks his father for the early inheritance and sold the inheritance and abandoned the community. And there's also ceremonial law or religious law that dealt with the religious rituals of purification. And he's breaking this law by working with the pigs. So as he returns back to his father, yes, he's returning as a fool, a remorseful fool, but more than a fool. A fool who's broken and violated every agreement and understanding held by his family, by his people, by his community, by his God. A fool who's broken holiness. And holiness is important because if he'd been obedient to his father, if he'd respected the community, if he would have been living within the boundaries of holiness, he wouldn't have ended up in this spot. Now, if holiness is the only standard, this kid has no chance. No chance. If holiness is the only standard, they're going to see him walking on that path. And the community is going to come out to greet him with some rocks in their hands. And they're going to start throwing rocks until he turns around and ends up in some pig pen in some other town. But while he was still a long way off, he sees the road to his father's house is getting closer. He's probably close enough to see the familiar landmarks, and you know what that's like. You got that tree on your street that you know it's always been there. He can see his father's cattle. He can see the outline of his father's house. And think about how he feels right now. His heart's beating heavy. His thoughts are racing. He's hopeful, but aware. Hopeful, but realistic. Hopeful, but he knows he doesn't really stand much of a chance. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him. His father saw him. What's he going to say? Will he reject him? Will he turn him away? Will he scold him? Will he get the community? Will they pick up rocks? Will his father lead that? His father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. It's almost as if his father was watching and waiting all along, waiting daily for that figure to show up on the horizon. And he sees his boy. He sees the tattered clothing. He sees his emaciated, worn figure. He sees his tired, weary steps, walking not with confidence, but with shame. And he ran to his son. He didn't wait for the people in the community to see him. He didn't wait for another person to meet him first. And he didn't greet him with coldness or indifference. He didn't interview him to find out what he had done. He loved his son with all his imperfections, and so he ran. He threw his arms around him and he kissed him. He kissed the returning fool, the returning lawbreaker, the returning failure, and greeted him with love. And so there's no mistake about the Father's intentions. There's no hesitation. There's no conversation with the neighbors or family member. He didn't get together and say, what should we do? Should we take him back? Here's what he's done. I got reports from the foreign country. Here's what he's done. Pig pen, prostitutes, sold all he had. Should we take him back? No. There's no conversation. He runs. You can imagine the son feeling a tremendous amount of relief. Finally, he's got the opportunity to give that speech to his dad. That speech he's been preparing every step of the way. Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. So he has this awareness that he's offended his father, but he's also offended God. So he's worthy, not of his inheritance, not of love, not of getting his place back, but worthy of being cast aside. He just wants to be a servant. He just wants some table scraps. But the father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. So the father doesn't even let him finish his speech. He doesn't even let him finish, and he's calling to his servants, bring the best robe. Get these rags off my son. Put a robe on him. Adorn this filthy hand with a ring. And put sandals on his blistered feet. The robe would tell the community that my son has been restored. A ring says he shares all my wealth and power. And the sandals say, my son isn't going anywhere. He's back. He's home. Notice, he orders the servant to bring these gifts while he's still on the road. He doesn't wait till his son comes back in the house because he wants his neighbors to see. He wants his bold love and audacity to be on display to his friends and his neighbors to witness. And he wants his son to know that he's not ashamed of him, but he's rejoicing over his return. Verse 23 says, bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost, but now is found. And so they began to celebrate. The last gift was the fattened calf. And the fattened calf was for celebrating. It's something that you kept all year long. You waited for that perfect opportunity for a feast where you were going to invite all the community. And he uses this opportunity to celebrate the return of his son. Now, there's grace. There's grace all over this story. This story is drenched with grace, dripping with grace. We see the son who represents the tax collectors and criminals and sinners who came to see Jesus. He was lost and he was broken and he was beat up and he was ashamed. And the father represents God. And he showers him with love and affection and forgiveness and hope. And he restores him back to the place that he once was. This is what grace does. It gives us hope that we can't earn and love that we don't deserve. Hope that we can't earn and love that we don't deserve. But remember, the father had two sons. And if the first son represented recklessness, the second son represented rules. If the first son represented grace, the second son represented holiness. Well, that second son, he's out in the field, and he hears some commotion. And when he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him, what's going on? And the servant said, your brother's come, And your father has killed the fattened calf because he's back safe and sound. And so there's multiple layers of shock and surprise here. Why is my brother back? Why have we taken him back? So it's just okay for my brother to show up here again? Why are we killing the prize animal, the fattened calf, for this degenerate? Why are we inviting him back into this community that he left? He didn't want anything to do with us. The older brother became angry and refused to go inside. So his father went out and pleaded with him. The son is so angry and so hurt and so jealous that he can't stand to look at his brother. He can't stand to look at his father. So he won't even go inside. The father comes out and he begs him with all his passion and sincerity. Son, please come back inside. Your brother, he's alive. Your brother is back. This is grace and holiness colliding. Dad, he doesn't deserve it. But he's back, son. Dad, he doesn't deserve it. He hasn't earned it. But son, he's back. The son, he begins to share his case. He says, look, Dad, all these years I've been slaving for you, and I never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. The son says, I've worked hard for you. I've worked in these fields every single day. I've listened to you. I've taken your advice. I've been respectful and obedient. I followed the laws of your house, the laws of this community, the laws of God. You never gave me a party like this. You never gave me so much as a goat. Yet here is that son of yours. And notice how he disassociates himself from his brother. Here is that son of yours, the one who's broken all of your laws and squandered all of your money, and you've given him the best that we own. You've given him a robe and a ring and sandals. And the father replies, my son, you are always with me and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead as in and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So in tenderness, the father responds, son, you already had a portion of what was mine. But your brother, notice how the father reorients the older son to the relationship with the younger son. Your brother was lost and dying, but he's back. He's been found, and it's worth celebrating. So if this is grace and holiness colliding, what's the balance? Is the son wrong because he lived an upstanding life? Is the father wrong because he embraced his lost son? What's the balance? Let's read verse 31 again. My son, the father said, you are always with me and everything I have is yours. So right off the bat, the father is establishing relational intimacy. My son, you belong to me. I'm your father. And then he reminds the son that he's always been favored. He's always been inside the father's love. And then he reminds the son that everything he has also belongs to him. The son's obedience and commitment to holiness is recognized, and it's why the father trusts him so much. It's why they've never broken relationship. And because of his commitment to holiness, he's not had to deal with the pain and shame of failure. He's not had to endure the pain and the rejection and the humiliation like his brother has. The one who left, the son who left, he has to deal with the consequences of his actions for the rest of his life. The older son would never have to deal with that. So son, your holiness is to your benefit. But, verse 32, we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. The father says, my own son who left me. My own son said he didn't want me anymore. He didn't want us anymore. He violated holiness in some that broke my heart. But it broke his heart too. And now he's back. He's back for a new life. He's back for a new story. So if I'm in that crowd, if I'm listening to this story, if I'm listening to Jesus, I see the benefits of holiness. Because holiness keeps me away from self-inflicted pain. Because I don't want to feel the pain of my mistakes. I want to stay near to God so I don't fall on my face over and over and over. And I understand that the purpose of holiness is not to exclude. Listen, the purpose of holiness is not to exclude. The purpose of holiness is to nurture and to protect and to provide safety, because when we're living and modeling after God, we're in his embrace, we're in his intimacy, we're under his protection. But when I falter, when I've fallen, when I've turned my back on God, grace says, come back to me and I'll restore you. Come back to me and I'll put my robe on you and celebrate over you and teach you to be holy again. But holiness drenched in endless waves of grace. Endless waves of grace. What we miss in this story is the significance of the father running. Because in the ancient Near East, men didn't run. You couldn't run with a tunic on because you didn't wear anything underneath of your tunic. So you had to take it off, or you had to pull it up and tie it around your waist. Imagine what the neighbors would have thought when they saw this half-naked man sprinting towards his son. They would have called him a fool. Hey, look at that fool out there running towards his foolish child. They would have said he was shameful. Look at that shameful man running towards his shameful son. They deserve each other. They would have said he was reckless. Reckless for that son that he loved. In all his holiness, God isn't too dignified to pursue us recklessly. In all his holiness, God isn't too dignified to pursue us like a fool. In all his holiness, God isn't too dignified to come running after us. Even in our sin, he wants us anyways. When we're failing, he still pursues us. When we've been a fool, he keeps running after us. Running for a fool like us. I don't know where you're at as you come to church this morning. I don't know where you stand in your relationship with Jesus. I don't know what kind of guilt you brought in. I don't know what kind of pain you brought in. I don't know what kind of shame you brought in. But know this as you sit there. God pursues you recklessly. He pursues you with passion. Pursues you and waits for you on the horizon as you come. Because he's been waiting, drawing you in, waiting to embrace you. That's the God that we serve. A God who calls us to holiness, but holiness drenched in waves of grace. And so I want to pray for you this morning. Just close your eyes. Father, I want to pray. I want to pray that you remind us this morning that we are loved. I want to pray this morning, Father, that you remind us that you pursue us. I want to pray this morning, God, that you give us a touch of your love for us. I want to pray this morning, God, that if we're feeling like we're unloved or we're feeling like we don't deserve it, you remind us, God, that it's true, we don't. We don't deserve it, but your love never runs out. Your passion for us never runs out. And in you we find hope. Run for us, Jesus. Run for us. We'll embrace you because we need you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.